In just 72 hours, J.D. Vance turned the nation upside down. A single revelation, a secret deal, hidden in the shadows for years, sent shockwaves through every household, from small-town diners to bustling city squares. This wasn't just politics as usual. It was a betrayal felt by millions of American workers, men and women who'd given everything to build this country, only to learn their future had been bargained away behind closed doors. Picture it, the majestic Capitol chamber, packed wall to wall. Lawmakers frozen in place, cameras rolling, and at the center of it all, Barack Obama, once untouchable, his face pale as the tape played out. Not a sound, not a cough, not a whisper, just the weight of a truth too heavy to ignore. And in that silence, one question echoed louder than any voice. What would you do if you learned your leaders sold out your future? Before we begin this journey, know this. While the story you're about to hear is fictional, a dramatization crafted to explore what if, the emotions it stirs are real. The questions it asks are the ones we all wrestle with. Loyalty, truth, and the price of silence. So as you watch, let your heart engage, your mind reflect, and your spirit be stirred. Because sometimes even imagined stories hold truths that matter. Stay with us, because some truths are worth hearing, even when they challenge everything we thought we knew. It was nearly midnight. The world outside J.D. Vance's modest home on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., had fallen into that heavy, expectant silence that only comes in the deepest part of the night. Streetlights cast pools of amber on empty sidewalks. Beyond his window, the city's heartbeat seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Inside, J.D. sat alone in his study, sleeves rolled up, collar loosened, surrounded by the soft rustle of paper. His desk was strewn with reports, grim ones, charts of unemployment figures in Midwest towns where factories once roared, now ghostly quiet. Tables of job losses, bankruptcies, rising poverty. He traced his finger down a column labeled Jackson, Ohio, his hometown. The number beside it hit like a punch. 37% unemployment in the manufacturing sector. He leaned back, rubbing tired eyes, haunted by faces he'd met just weeks ago. A machinist who'd lost his home. A waitress who cried while thanking him for noticing towns like hers still existed. And then, the shrill break of the phone. A sound that didn't belong in that stillness. J.D. stared at it for a beat, unease prickling the back of his neck. Midnight calls rarely brought good news. Slowly he picked up. "Vance," he said, voice low, cautious. On the other end, his chief of staff. Normally unflappable, but now his voice was tight, brittle, like a man struggling to contain something. "Sir, we've got something disturbing." J.D.'s heart kicked hard. He straightened in his chair. "What is it?" A breath shaky. Then, "An anonymous tip. It came through back channels about an hour ago. They say there's a recording, a leak. It features Obama." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. J.D. felt his pulse thrum in his ears. A recording of what? The tipster didn't want to say over unsecured lines. Only that it's Obama, and he's heard making promises to foreign leaders, promises about our economy, about American jobs. A pause. J.D.'s mind raced. His first instinct was disbelief. It had to be a hoax or a smear, a prank played on someone who'd risen too fast, spoken too plainly. But his gut, that old steelworker's instinct honed in Jackson's mills and his mama's kitchen, said otherwise. He felt it deep in his bones. This wasn't noise. This was a signal. "Where's the recording now?" J.D. asked, voice dropping into that low, steady tone his team knew meant action was coming. "Langley's trying to verify authenticity. They want to brief you at first light. But sir, the tipster said one more thing." J.D. gripped the phone tighter. "What?" "That if the recording gets out, it could change everything." For a heartbeat, J.D. said nothing. He stood, moving to the window, looking out at the city that slept beneath his watch. The Capitol dome glowed faintly in the distance, a sentinel in the night, and suddenly everything felt fragile. as if the promise of America itself hung on the next decision he made. He drew a long breath. Get me everything. No filters. No spin. And keep this quiet. We don't even breathe this outside the room until we know the truth. Yes, sir. The line went dead. JD stayed at the window, gaze fixed on the Capitol. Somewhere out there, a storm had begun, and soon it would reach them all. And as the night deepened, one question burned in his mind. What if the deal was real? What if the people who trusted me had been sold out, long before I ever stepped onto this stage? The Capitol still slept as J.D. Vance stepped into the small windowless room deep beneath a federal building, the kind of place built for quiet crises. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting pale halos on the table where his most trusted team had gathered. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of what they were about to hear. J.D. carried the tension of that midnight call with him, the echoes of his own questions still fresh. What if the deal was real? What if the people who trusted me had been sold out? And now, perhaps, he was about to learn the answer. Without ceremony, his intelligence liaison, a gray-haired man who'd seen too much and spoke too little, slid a recorder onto the table. JD's gaze met his team's, his chief of staff, pale from lack of sleep, his communications lead, already calculating outcomes, his legal advisor, eyes narrowed with cautious dread. No one spoke. The liaison pressed play. At first it was just static, the kind that prickles your skin and makes you lean in, hoping to catch the shape of something beneath the noise. And then it came. A voice, muffled, distant, but chillingly familiar. The cadence unmistakable. Barack Obama, calm, measured, confident in the way only those who believe themselves unchallengeable can be. Future economic accommodations assure our partners stability through flexibility, long-term market adjustments. American capacity can absorb transitional impacts. The words bled together in patches, a puzzle with too many missing pieces, but the tone carried more than enough. JD felt his gut tighten, his jaw clench. He didn't hear policy language. He heard betrayal disguised as diplomacy. His mind couldn't help but pull him back. To Jackson, to the shuttered factories, the silent mills, the diner where a waitress's eyes had welled up as she'd whispered, "Don't forget about us." He thought of his grandfather's voice. A man's word is his worth. The tape crackled on. Snippets of another voice, foreign, perhaps European, responding with what sounded like guarded approval. JD's team exchanged glances, unease thickening with every passing second. When the tape finally ended, the room stayed silent. No one seemed willing to be the first to break the spell. It was the chief of staff who spoke, voice low, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. It could be doctored. We've seen deepfakes more sophisticated than this. We shouldn't jump. The legal advisor shook her head. But it fits. The patterns, the phrasing, and whoever leaked this knew what they were sending. They wanted him to hear it. Or they wanted to take him down, the communications lead offered, though even as she said it, the words felt thin. JD remained standing, staring at the blank recorder, as if willing it to offer more. His thoughts raced. If it was a hoax, it was cruel. If it was real, it was catastrophic. The stakes weren't political anymore. This was about the soul of the promise he'd sworn to defend. He drew in a slow breath, grounding himself in the moment. "Enough guessing," he said, voice steady but resolute. "We find the truth. We verify the source, the authenticity, every syllable. And no one breathes a word of this outside these walls." As the team nodded, the tension in the room didn't lift. If anything, it deepened, because what they'd heard couldn't be unheard, and what they'd started couldn't be stopped. And so, as they filed out into the dim corridors of power, one thought bound them all. Whatever storm this was, they were in it now. The corridors of power had barely begun to stir with the first light of dawn when the storm outside took on a life of its own. What had been a whisper in the dark, confined to JD's inner circle, now began leaking in fragments. No one knew how or from where. Maybe it was the leak source themselves seeking to light the fire. Maybe it was an overheard word, a loose end somewhere in the chain. But by morning, social media had erupted. Phrases like Obama's secret deal, economic betrayal, and leaked recording trended across platforms. Anonymous accounts hinted at tapes too dangerous to broadcast. Others claimed to have heard snippets, adding fuel to the frenzy. Pundits speculated wildly. Was it real? Was it foreign propaganda? Was J.D. Vance himself behind it, plotting some bold political maneuver? Screens across the nation flickered with headlines, but none had answers. Only questions, each one more urgent than the last. In the middle of it all, J.D. watched the chaos unfold from his den, sleepless and weary. The secure briefing had ended hours ago, but the weight of what they had heard pressed on him like a stone. He had tried to rest, to gather himself for what would come, but the quiet of his house had offered no peace. The hum of uncertainty was louder than any siren. Finally, unable to bear the restless churn within, J.D. stepped out into the cool night air. His yard was still, the world outside his gate unaware of the storm gathering beyond the headlines. The Capitol dome glimmered faintly on the horizon, a fragile beacon. He crossed the lawn and stopped at the flagpole. There it was, the stars and stripes, limp in the night breeze, but no less powerful. He gazed up at it, heart heavy with the burden of what he now carried. Was he doing the right thing? The question echoed in the quiet. Exposing this could tear the nation apart. Markets could collapse on a rumor alone. Faith in leadership could fracture. And if the recording proved false, the damage would be his to own. But if it was true, if the promises had been made, if the future of the workers he swore to protect had been bartered away, could he live with silence? He thought of Jackson, the mills cold and silent, the faces of men and women who had shaken his hand and looked to him with hope. And then in the dark, J.D. made his vow, not to cameras, not to crowds, but to himself. If this risks my career, so be it. The truth is worth more. The words left his lips like a quiet promise, carried on the breeze to no one but the night. He stayed there a long moment, drawing strength from that silent flag, before turning back toward the house. The storm was coming, and whatever it brought, J.D. knew he could not, and would not, stand aside. The promise J.D. Vance made to himself beneath that quiet flagpole clung to him like armor as the first gray light of morning crept over the city. There would be no turning back now. The storm he'd sensed in the night was at his door, and he would meet it head-on. Within hours, J.D. had quietly assembled a meeting in a secure federal conference room. No press, no leaks, no staff beyond those he trusted as he trusted family. The room was stark, all clean lines and cold steel, a place built for war councils and crisis decisions. Around the table sat a handful of men and women with decades of experience, people who had seen things that never made the news, who had buried secrets deeper than most could imagine. There was the retired CIA analyst who once led covert operations in Europe, a former NSA cyber forensics chief who spoke in clipped sentences and seemed to hear threats in the hum of the overhead lights. Two cybersecurity specialists who had left lucrative private sector jobs because, as one put it, there are some threats too big to ignore. And, at JD's insistence, a pair of trusted senators, one Democrat, one Republican, both battle-scarred veterans of Washington's dirtiest fights. The tension in the room was palpable. No one needed to be reminded of what was at stake. JD's team played their recording again, this time on equipment designed to catch the smallest anomalies. A hitch in cadence, a frequency out of place, the signature of manipulation. As the audio filled the room, all those present listened with the kind of focus that makes the world beyond fall away. Obama's voice, or what sounded like it, emerged from the static, calm, controlled. The words came in fragments but clear enough to chill the room. Future economic accommodations, transitional impact absorbed domestically, assurance to partners. JD's jaw tightened with each phrase. He watched the faces around the table. No one smirked. No one scoffed. These were people trained to doubt everything, and even they looked uneasy. The NSA veteran spoke first. His voice was low, grave. If it's a fake, it's the best I've ever heard. The voice print matches. Cadence is right. Background hum consistent with an embassy-grade recording device. If I were betting my pension, I'd say it's real. The cyber specialist nodded grimly. We'll keep testing, but nothing so far screams fabrication. And the metadata, well, it's dirty, but not in a way that suggests manipulation. More like someone tried to cover their tracks after the fact. For a long moment, no one said anything. JD stared down at his hands, fingers curled into fists against the table's cold edge. His thoughts slipped unbidden to Jackson, to the man who'd shaped him more than any politician or professor, his grandfather, the steel worker who rose before dawn, who came home bone-tired but proud, who taught JD what mattered most wasn't how loud a man spoke, but how true he stood. You don't turn from hard truths, son, he had said once, sweat streaking his brow as he came in from the mill. You face them. That's the job. JD lifted his gaze, the steel in his grandfather's words settling into his spine. The weight of what he'd heard, what they were uncovering, felt immense. But the path forward was clear. We keep going, JD said quietly. We peel this apart until there's no doubt, no spin, no politics, just the truth. And when we have it, we act. Heads nodded. The meeting broke with no handshakes, no words of comfort, only the silent understanding of those who knew they were stepping deeper into something that could shake the nation's very foundation. The room had emptied, but the weight of that meeting clung to J.D. Vance like a second skin. The truth, or at least the terrifying shape of it, was taking form, and with it came the cold certainty that forces beyond that room would not let him seek it unchallenged. By the next morning, the pushback began. It was subtle at first, the kind of pressure that wasn't written down or spoken aloud, but carried in quiet glances in the sudden distance of allies who no longer returned calls as quickly in the polite but pointed reminders about responsibility and the greater good. The media moved faster than even JD expected. Headlines shifted like a tide, each more damning than the last. Vance peddles dangerous conspiracy theory. Vice President risks national stability chasing ghosts. Nightly news panels filled with polished voices accused him of stoking division at a time when the nation needed unity. Talk show hosts mocked him, painting him as paranoid, desperate for attention, a man who had let ambition cloud his judgment. Donors who had once filled JD's war chest began to disappear like smoke. Emails went unanswered. Promises of support dissolved without explanation. A few were bold enough to send messages wrapped in the language of concern. You're better than this, JD. We urge you to reconsider this path before it's too late. But beneath their words, JD heard the unspoken warning, step back or be destroyed. And then came the calls, not many and never direct, always routed through layers of distance, as if the voices at the other end could deny later that they had ever spoken. Advisors of former presidents, senior party officials, figures with no official title but immense influence. Their tone was measured, but their meaning clear. National security, Mr. Vice President. This isn't just about you. Be mindful of the stability of the nation. Sometimes truth has a cost that's too high. Be sure you're ready to pay it. JD listened to every one of them, thanked them for their time, and hung up. He felt the net tightening, strand by invisible strand. The more he pressed forward, the more the machinery of power moved to stop him. At home, the strain began to show. His wife, Emily, who had stood beside him through battles large and small, watched the storm gather with growing dread. One evening, after the children had gone to bed and the house had fallen into uneasy quiet, she found him at the kitchen table, surrounded by reports, notes, the transcript of the recording now burned into his mind. JD, she said softly, please, be careful. They'll destroy you if you keep pushing this. He looked up at her, seeing not just fear in her eyes, but love. Fierce, protective, desperate to keep their family whole. For a moment, the armor he wore in public cracked, and he let the weight of it all show. I know, he said quietly, but if I stop, if I let this die in the dark, then what's the point of anything we fought for? Emily didn't answer. She only reached for his hand, holding it tightly, as if that alone might keep him safe from what was coming. The night pressed in around them, the quiet before a greater storm. And JD knew that with every step forward, the battle was only just beginning. The house was dark except for the soft glow of a single lamp in JD Vance's study. Emily had gone to bed hours ago, but JD remained at the kitchen table, the same transcripts and reports spread before him like a battlefield map. The warnings, the threats, the quiet exodus of allies, each weighed heavily on his mind. The storm he had sensed was no longer brewing on the horizon. It was here, and it was relentless. Yet somewhere beneath the exhaustion, beneath the pressure threatening to crush him, his resolve hardened. He could not, would not walk away. The shrill buzz of his secure phone shattered the stillness. JD's pulse jumped. Only a handful of people had that number. He hesitated, then answered. Vance. A voice low and cautious, familiar but unexpected. Sir, I can't stay on long, but I need you to listen carefully. JD frowned, leaning forward as if the distance between them could somehow be closed. Who is this? Let's just say, an old hand from the West Wing. I was there when some of this went down, and there's more you need to see. JD's breath caught, the fatigue of the night momentarily forgotten. The voice on the other end didn't waver, but JD could hear the tension beneath it, the weight of a man stepping onto dangerous ground. Why come to me? JD asked quietly. Because I saw your speech in Ohio, because you're the only one who might not bury this, and because I can't carry it anymore. A pause. JD's mind raced. A former White House aide, someone who had been in the room, who had heard or seen what no one else dared speak of. What is it? I can't say over the line. Just know, the tape, it's not the only piece. There's more. Documents, correspondence, things that connect the dots, things that prove this wasn't just words in the dark. JD's grip tightened on the phone. This was what he needed. Confirmation that the storm wasn't made of shadows. Where? I'll send instructions. Secure drop. You'll have it within 48 hours. But Vance, be ready. Once you see it, there's no going back. The line went dead before JD could respond. He sat there, the silence rushing in to fill the space where the voice had been. The house around him felt smaller now, the night deeper, but for the first time in days, the isolation lifted, if only slightly. Somewhere out there, someone else believed the truth mattered. JD stood, moving to the window, looking out across the sleeping city. The Capitol dome rose in the distance, pale against the night sky. He felt the weight of that man's words settle on his shoulders, heavy but clarifying. No going back. He whispered the phrase to himself, tasting its truth. Whatever came next, the path was set. The storm had a name now, and soon it would have proof. In the darkness of his study, JD felt his resolve sharpen like steel. He turned from the window, the first glimmers of dawn just brushing the edge of the sky. The fight was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The first light of dawn that had crept over JD Vance's study window the night of the call came full circle now, casting golden beams across the faces of hundreds packed into the worn auditorium of a small-town Ohio high school. JD stood at the edge of the stage, gazing out at the sea of working-class Americans, steelworkers in faded union jackets, farmers with calloused hands, small business owners, veterans. These were his people, the ones the reports reduced to numbers and charts, the ones whose hopes and struggles had driven him to this very moment. Days had passed since that fateful call, each filled with sleepless hours and mounting tension. The leak had spread like wildfire. Rumors swirled. The whispers JD had tried to contain had escaped, and with them came the fury of a nation both frightened and desperate for truth. The media had painted him as reckless. The elites had tried to shame him into silence. But here, in this room, he saw none of that. Here he saw only eyes that pleaded, "Tell us the truth. Stand for us." He stepped to the microphone. The room fell so silent he could hear the hum of the old lights overhead. JD took a breath, steadying himself. Then he spoke, not with polish or practiced sound bites, but with the raw honesty of a man who had carried the weight of betrayal and knew the price of silence. "What do we stand for?" JD began, his voice echoing to the rafters. "If not our workers, What do we stand for, if not our sovereignty? Are we a nation that sells out those who built it just to please those who never lifted a hand to help it? Or are we something more? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I have been told to be quiet, he continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. I have been warned that asking hard questions will cost me my career, maybe more. But I say this to you, if asking those questions makes me an enemy of the powerful, then I will wear that as a badge of honor. Because no title, no position, no office is worth more than my loyalty to you, the people who make this nation what it is. Applause broke out, first tentative, then swelling. JD pressed on, the fire in his voice now impossible to ignore. I don't come to you with answers packaged in slogans. I come to you with the same questions that keep you up at night. Why are our factories empty? Why do our jobs leave but our bills stay? Why do those who were trusted to serve you act as if you're the ones who should apologize for asking why? By now, phones were up everywhere, recording, streaming. His words, meant first for this room, spilled out onto the airwaves, social media feeds, news alerts. Within minutes, snippets of his speech were viral. What do we stand for if not our workers? No title is worth more than loyalty to the people. Clips reached steel towns in Pennsylvania, farming communities in Iowa, urban neighborhoods where workers felt forgotten. In the hall, JD closed with quiet resolve. I promise you this, I will not stop until we know the truth. I will not stop until those who traded your future in backroom deals are held to account. Because this fight, it's not mine alone, it's ours, and together we will not be ignored. The ovation that followed was thunderous, not of empty cheer, but of shared purpose. JD stepped back, heart pounding, knowing that whatever came next, the nation was watching and standing. The echoes of applause from JD Vance's fiery speech in Ohio were still reverberating across the country when the first signs of coordinated resistance began to surface. JD had known it was coming. No one challenged the status quo without awakening the full force of the machinery designed to protect it. But even he was struck by the speed and precision with which it unfolded. It started with carefully worded statements from high-level operatives, former aides, party elders, think tank heads. The language was always measured, always polished, but the meaning beneath it was sharp as a blade. JD's claims, they said, were dangerous fiction, the product of a man clearly overwhelmed by the burdens of high office, and a sad attempt to deflect from real issues with baseless conspiracy. They spoke of the importance of unity in a time of division, and warned darkly that reckless rhetoric has consequences. Cable news channels that had once sought JD's opinion now dissected his speech not for its substance, but for its supposed recklessness. Clips were edited, words pulled from context, framed to suggest that JD was fanning flames he could not control. Panels of polished pundits nodded gravely as they discussed how disappointing it was to see a leader many hoped would rise above such demagoguery. Late-night comedians joined the chorus, their monologues dripping with mockery. JD became the punchline of the week, a man chasing shadows, tilting at windmills, seeing plots behind every corner. Social media feeds filled with slickly produced memes casting him as unhinged, unstable, a man who had lost his way. Editorials followed, written by voices of the establishment with headlines that left no room for doubt, the dangerous delusions of J.D. Vance, when populism becomes paranoia. How J.D. Vance lost the plot. The speed of it all was dizzying. J.D. watched as the storm he had hoped to direct toward the truth was instead turned against him. Friends in high places grew distant, cautious, as if fearing that his fall might pull them down as well. Donors who had once cheered his every stand now issued polite statements about refocusing on priorities. Even some of those who had clapped loudest in the Ohio Hall went quiet, uncertain of how to navigate the tidal wave of opinion bearing down. And yet, beneath the din of condemnation, J.D. saw something else, something the polished voices missed. The clips of his speech, even when mocked, were spreading faster than any talking head could contain. The raw, unfiltered moments, the fire in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes, resonated with people far beyond that auditorium. In diners, union halls, truck cabs, kitchen tables, Americans shared the video, debated its meaning, felt the weight of the questions he had asked. JD stood at his office window late one night, watching the city's lights flicker beneath a dark sky, the Capitol dome in the distance. The noise outside was deafening, designed to drown him out. But he knew the truth. They wouldn't fight this hard if the questions didn't matter. He turned from the window, his reflection caught in the glass, and felt his resolve deepen. Let them call him unhinged. Let them mock. The people who mattered, the ones forgotten by the headlines, were listening, and he would not stop speaking. The din of voices condemning J.D. Vance grew louder with each passing day, but so too did the quiet rumble of support from the places where America's promises felt long abandoned. In small towns, in mill communities and farm counties, J.D.'s words from that Ohio stage spread like wildfire, not through official channels, but from neighbor to neighbor, family to family, passed along with a mix of hope and defiance. His approval ratings in those regions began to climb, steadily at first, then with unmistakable momentum. In diners where factory workers nursed late-night coffee, in union halls where old flags hung faded but proud, people spoke his name with a kind of wary pride. He was saying what they had long felt and what no one else seemed willing to voice. But beyond those forgotten corners of the country, the backlash hardened. In urban centers, among the political elite, the cultural tastemakers, and the media power brokers, J.D. became a symbol of everything they warned against. Populism unbound, recklessness disguised as courage, a threat to the order they had built. Editorial boards sharpened their critiques. Television commentators, once careful not to alienate his supporters, now spoke with open disdain. The gulf between the America that J.D. championed and the America that condemned him yawned wider with every headline. And then the threats began to find their way closer to home. First, the anonymous letters, slid beneath doors or mailed without return addresses, vague, menacing, full of veiled warnings. Then more direct harassment, a brick through the window of his local office, spray-painted slurs across a campaign billboard. His family felt the tremors most. Emily, once a source of steady calm, began to watch the news with growing dread, scanning faces in crowds, double-checking locked doors at night. At school, their children bore the brunt of the storm in ways that cut deepest. Whispers followed them in hallways. Friendships strained under the weight of politics they could scarcely understand. Their eldest came home one afternoon, quiet and pale, his backpack torn, a cruel word scrawled across one of his notebooks. J.D. had seen bruises like that before, not on skin, but in spirit, and it broke something in him to see it on his own child. That night, the family sat at the dinner table, the meal gone, mostly untouched, the air heavy with things left unsaid. J.D. looked at each of them, at Emily's tired eyes, at the children trying to be brave, at the home they had built together, now under siege from forces neither of them had sought. His thoughts ran deeper than words. They deserve more than this. They deserve safety. They deserve peace. They deserve a father who fights for their future. J.D. didn't say it aloud. He didn't need to. He saw in Emily's glance that she understood. He saw in his children's quiet resilience that they were stronger than the world gave them credit for. And so, as the night pressed in and the weight of the nation's divide settled heavier on his shoulders, J.D. steeled himself. The cost was high, but the cause, the truth, demanded nothing less. The lines that divided the nation in the wake of J.D. Vance's stand grew sharper, but it wasn't just words and opinions that shifted. It was the very foundation of the country's confidence. Markets, already uneasy in uncertain times, began to jitter. Stocks dipped. The dollar wavered. Analysts debated endlessly on cable news. Was it the global climate? Economic cycles? Or was it, as many claimed, the direct result of a vice president stirring chaos with unfounded accusations and dangerous insinuations? J.D.'s name became shorthand for instability in the financial pages, a cautionary tale for those who watched markets first and everything else second. J.D. followed the headlines, the tickers, the grim-faced anchors on television, and for the first time in weeks, doubt began to creep in where resolve had stood. He had braced for the political storm, for the personal cost. But this, the sight of retirement funds shrinking, of small investors panicking, of workers fearing new layoffs in towns already hanging by a thread. This he hadn't prepared for. The questions that had haunted him in the quiet of night now demanded answers. Was he doing more harm than good? Had his pursuit of truth, of honor, of loyalty to the forgotten somehow become the very threat he sought to fight? The pressure wasn't just economic. It came in softer, more insidious forms. Powerful interests, men and women who rarely spoke in public but whose influence shaped the world behind closed doors, reached out, always through intermediaries, always with language polished to a shine. They offered advice, framed as concern. They suggested a strategic pause or a redirection of focus. Some hinted at future rewards. A foundation chair, a consultancy, a soft landing for a man who had done his duty and could now gracefully exit the stage. Others offered more bluntly, financial incentives, speaking engagements, partnerships that could secure not just JD's future, but his family's. At first, JD ignored them. Then when they persisted, he refused outright. But each offer, each subtle attempt to buy him off or lure him away from his course, left a residue, a reminder of how high the stakes truly were, and how many would do anything to protect their power. In quieter moments, JD sat alone, far from the cameras, far from the noise, and let the weight of it all settle. He thought of the flag outside his home, of the workers whose hands had built it, of the children who would inherit the nation he helped shape. Was he truly protecting them, or had he, in his zeal, set in motion forces that could break what he most longed to defend? The questions came without answers. The nights grew longer, the mornings heavier. And yet, through it all, JD felt the same quiet truth that had guided him since that first midnight call. That there were moments in a man's life when the cost of silence was far greater than the cost of standing firm. As he gazed out at the city he had sworn to serve, JD knew that whatever the price, the pursuit of truth was no longer a choice. It was a duty, and he would see it through no matter how high the cost. The weight of the days had grown heavier and the nights longer. JD Vance sat alone in his office, long after the lights of the Capitol had dimmed and the hum of the city had quieted to a low, restless murmur. His desk, usually neat out of habit, was cluttered now with papers, clippings, and something more corrosive. Letters, emails, printed and marked. Messages that had crossed the line from criticism to outright hate. Some were anonymous, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Others more polished, as if drafted with care, as if the sender wanted the words to cut deeper. The threats varied in tone, some vague, others chillingly specific. "You'll pay for this. Turn back before it's too late. Your family won't be safe." JD read them all, not because he sought to dwell on them, but because each reminded him of what was at stake, and perhaps on some level, he believed that to confront them was to deny them power. He leaned back, the creak of his chair loud in the stillness, and stared at the framed photo on his bookshelf. His grandfather in work clothes, standing in front of the Jackson Mill, a man who had given his strength to something larger than himself without complaint. JD let his gaze linger there, drawing from it the sense of purpose that felt harder to hold in these dark hours. Eventually, unable to sit with the weight any longer, JD rose, grabbed his coat, and stepped out into the night. The air was cool, the streets mostly empty. The city paused between yesterday's battles and tomorrow's. He walked without destination at first, letting his feet carry him where they would, until at last they brought him to a place he had visited often in quieter times, the Veterans Memorial. The stone walls stood silent under the stars, etched with names that told the story of sacrifice. JD moved among them slowly, reading the names, some familiar, some not, feeling the gravity of what they had given. Here there was no noise, no opinion pieces, no market reports or cable news panels. Here there was only the truth of service, of men and women who had stood when standing mattered most. He stood before one panel longer than the others, hand resting lightly on the cold stone, and let the stillness settle over him. The questions that had plagued him, about cost, about risk, about whether he was helping or harming, felt smaller here. Not gone, but clearer in their place. By the time he returned home, dawn was just beginning to touch the horizon with pale light. Emily was waiting, seated at the kitchen table, a quiet strength in her gaze. She didn't speak at first, letting him settle, letting the night's weight ease from his shoulders. When she did, her words were soft, but steady. "If you don't fight," she said, meeting his eyes, "who will?" JD didn't answer, not with words. He reached for her hand, held it tight, and in that moment found again the resolve he feared had begun to slip. The storm was far from over, but the dawn was coming, and he would be ready. Morning light filtered through J.D. Vance's office windows, soft but unrelenting, as if determined to expose every shadow the night had left behind. The exhaustion of the previous day still clung to him, but beneath it, something steadier had taken root. The quiet resolve rekindled in the early hours at the memorial, in Emily's steady gaze, in the names etched in stone that reminded him why he fought. Yet as he gathered with his inner circle that morning, he knew resolve alone wouldn't be enough. The forces aligned against him were moving faster, darker, and more cleverly than he'd anticipated. His senior advisor began the briefing without preamble. "Sir, we've uncovered something you need to see." On the table between them lay a series of reports, documents JD had not authorized, statements he had never made, connections he had never claimed. His team had traced their origins, all planted, all calculated. Fabricated financial records suggesting JD had shady ties abroad. Doctored emails leaked to friendly media hinting that his crusade was driven not by truth, but by personal vendettas. Alleged witnesses lined up to quietly question his mental fitness. The threads formed a tapestry designed with one purpose: to discredit him so thoroughly that no truth he uncovered would ever be believed. JD leafed through the evidence, his jaw tightening as the full scope of it sank in. Each page was a reminder that the storm he'd felt gathering wasn't merely a political backlash. It was an orchestrated assault, precise and ruthless. "This isn't just damage control," the cyber analyst said quietly. "This was set in motion before you ever stepped on that stage in Ohio. Someone anticipated you wouldn't back down." JD let the words hang in the room. The patterns were clear now. The speed of the hit pieces, the coordination of the media offensive, the sudden flood of false leads and fake scandals. It was no accident. It was the machinery of power defending itself the only way it knew how. For a moment, doubt tried to creep in again. Was this fight unwinnable? But the doubt didn't last. If they were willing to go this far, if they were willing to burn credibility, to risk exposure of their own tactics just to stop him, then what lay beneath the surface had to be even darker than he'd feared. "If they're this desperate," JD said quietly, more to himself than to the room, "the truth must be deadly to them." His team watched him, waiting for the next move. JD straightened, the weight of sleepless nights and relentless attacks still heavy, but no longer slowing him. "We don't stop," he said. "We don't flinch. And we sure as hell don't let them write the story. We keep digging. We bring daylight where they want darkness." The meeting ended with nods, no false optimism, just the shared understanding of a team that knew the road ahead would only get harder. But they also knew something else. They were closer now, closer to the truth that so many seemed desperate to keep hidden. As JD stepped out into the corridor, the sun had fully risen, and with it came the next chapter of the fight. The weight of the morning's revelations still pressed heavily on J.D. Vance's shoulders as he returned to his office. The coordinated plot to discredit him had laid bare just how far powerful forces would go to bury the truth. But now, after all the threats, all the rumors, all the sleepless nights, the moment he'd been both hoping for and dreading had arrived. His secure line buzzed, once, twice, and the voice on the other end was quiet but resolute. "It's ready," the former White House aide said. "You'll have it within the hour." JD didn't ask questions. He simply replied, "Thank you," and ended the call, heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat. The aide's promise had carried him through the darkest days, and now at last the second recording, the proof that might change everything, was at hand. When the courier arrived, there were no words exchanged, no signatures signed. Just a slim, encrypted device left in JD's palm, as heavy as a stone. He took it to the secure room below his office. The same room where he had first heard the grainy, muffled tape that set this storm in motion. His core team joined him, faces tight with tension. No need for small talk or reassurances. They all understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. The lights dimmed slightly as the file was loaded. JD sat forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped, breath shallow. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that seems to thrum in the ears, as if even the walls were bracing for what was coming. And then it played. This was no muffled, patchy recording. The voice was clear, unmistakable. Barack Obama's familiar tone filled the space, measured and smooth, the voice that had once inspired millions, now carrying words that chilled the room to its core. That our commitment to future economic accommodations as discussed, we can ensure flexibility on domestic capacity where needed. In exchange, we trust our partners to consider reciprocal support on key initiatives in the coming years. A shared understanding for long-term alignment. JD felt the air leave his lungs. There was no ambiguity, no plausible deniability wrapped in clever phrasing. These were promises, promises of economic concessions, of bending the strength of American workers, made not to the people, but behind closed doors, traded for vague future favors. The tape continued, the foreign counterpart's voice now clearer as well, offering soft approvals, acknowledgments, subtle agreements masked in diplomatic language. The exchange was careful, deliberate, but the meaning beneath it was stark. When the recording ended, no one spoke at first. The room felt heavier, as if the truth itself had added weight to the air. JD leaned back slowly, eyes fixed on nothing, mind racing. He had imagined this moment countless times, what he would feel, what he would say. But now that it was here, the reality was sharper, more devastating than any of his fears. Finally, he broke the silence. "There it is," he said quietly. "The deal they said didn't exist, the truth they tried to bury." His team nodded, their faces a mix of shock and grim vindication. The proof was in their hands now, and with it came the certainty that everything from this point forward would change. JD stood, his decision already forming. "We go public, carefully, strategically, but this can't stay in the dark." The storm he had felt gathering had broken, and now there was no turning back. The truth, once buried beneath layers of denial and distraction, now rested in JD Vance's hands, and it was no longer his alone to bear. The decision came swiftly, not in haste but in clarity. There could be no more waiting, no more cautious circles. The second recording had to see daylight, but not as a weapon recklessly unleashed. This had to be done with precision. JD gathered his core team late that night, the city beyond their windows alive with flickering lights and restless anticipation, as if sensing the shift to come. They spoke in hushed tones, weighing every option. The tape couldn't simply be dumped into the chaos of social media, where it could be spun, distorted, buried again beneath noise. Instead, JD's team made a plan, targeted leaks to outlets that had earned the public's trust, voices that still believed in facts over spectacle. By dawn, the strategy was set in motion. The recording found its way to a handful of journalists known for their integrity, their refusal to play court to power. Within hours, headlines shifted, no longer filled with hollow condemnations of JD's supposed recklessness, but with the undeniable weight of what the nation could now hear for itself. Leaked tape confirms secret economic promises. Obama's private assurances to foreign leaders exposed. Workers betrayed? The deal that shook America. And America did shake. The reaction was immediate, visceral. Protests swelled in cities and small towns alike. Workers flooded the streets, not with rage alone, but with a demand that their voices be heard, that their sacrifices not be bartered away in rooms where they had no seat at the table. Signs rose high. Accountability now. No more backroom deals. Our jobs, our future. JD watched it unfold not with triumph, but with the gravity of a man who understood that this was no victory lap. This was the awakening of a nation long kept quiet by distraction and despair. The people had seen the truth, and now they demanded action. When JD stepped before the cameras, the weight of the moment was not lost on him. The room fell silent as he spoke, his voice steady, his eyes clear. America belongs to Americans. Period, he said. Our workers, our families, our future. It is not a bargaining chip. Not for foreign leaders, not for political gain, not for anyone. And I will stand with those demanding accountability, no matter the cost. The clip spread like wildfire, shared millions of times in a single day. It wasn't polished or rehearsed. It didn't need to be. It was the voice of a man speaking plainly to a nation that had longed to hear plain truth. JD returned to his office that night, the glow of protest fires and candlelit vigils visible in the distance, and felt the tide turning. Not because the fight was over, but because, for the first time, the people weren't fighting it alone. The roar of protests had yet to fade when Barack Obama, once revered as the steady hand of a turbulent era, stepped behind the presidential seal once more. Not as president, but as the former leader now forced to explain the inexplicable. The address was carried live across every network, his face framed by the familiar trappings of authority, the flags, the polished wood, the seal beneath his fingertips. But the weight that once gave comfort now seemed to hang heavier, as if the room itself bore witness to the storm outside. His voice was calm, the tone practiced, familiar. He spoke of service, of challenges faced, of the complexity of global diplomacy. He acknowledged the difficult decisions that come with leadership. But as the minutes passed, it became clear to those listening that what they were hearing was not clarity, not accountability, but evasion cloaked in the language of reason. Obama referred to taken out of context exchanges, mischaracterizations driven by political opportunism, conversations misrepresented for effect. He spoke of the danger of reckless rhetoric, of the responsibility of public servants to avoid inflaming division at such a fragile moment. He leaned into legalese, careful phrasing, words that gave no ground, admitted no fault, conceded nothing. JD watched from his office, the address playing on a muted screen, the images of marching workers and waving flags reflected faintly in the glass. The speech, meant to calm, felt instead like a widening chasm between those demanding the truth and those still determined to manage perception. As the broadcast ended, JD rose slowly, the weight of what came next settling into his bones. The time for cautious language was over. The time for hoping power would hold itself to account had passed. He stepped before the cameras in the press room that evening, his statement short, direct, unflinching. The nation needed no more carefully crafted explanations. It needed truth, plainly spoken. I've heard the former president's words tonight. So have you. And I ask him now, not as an opponent, not as a critic, but as a citizen of this nation. Stand before Congress. Face the people. Speak plainly, without lawyers, without scripts, without the safety of a prepared statement. Let the truth be judged where it matters most, by the people you served. The room went silent as his words settled. No flourish, no grandstanding. Just a challenge as old as the Republic itself. The call for those in power to answer to the people. The clip spread within minutes. Across news feeds and social media, the question echoed, would Obama accept? JD had drawn the line. Now the nation waited to see if its former leader would cross it. Outside, the protests grew louder, not in anger alone, but in hope that at last, accountability might come. And inside his office, JD stood at the window, watching the flicker of lights in the streets below, knowing that the next move would define not just the battle, but the legacy of the fight itself. The day arrived with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the entire nation. The Capitol stood like a fortress beneath a sky of steel gray, its steps lined with cameras, its halls filled with the hum of anticipation and the low murmur of history being written. Inside the chamber, every seat was filled. Senators, representatives, aides, reporters, and citizens lucky enough to claim a place all watched as the hearing convened. A hearing unlike any the country had witnessed in a generation. Cameras lined the walls, their red lights blinking, broadcasting the proceedings to millions. Screens across America glowed with the scene, the packed chamber, the witness table set beneath the glare of too many lights, the seal of the United States Congress hanging above it all, like a reminder of duty too often forgotten. And there sat Barack Obama, once the voice of hope, Now the man at the center of a storm he could no longer control. His posture was composed, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. His hands rested on the table, fingers laced tightly together, as if holding on to the last of his certainty. At the other end of the long dais sat J.D. Vance, his face marked by the weight of the fight that had brought him here. This was not a man eager for spectacle or personal vindication. This was a man prepared to do what the moment required, no matter the cost. J.D. began without flourish, his voice steady, the chamber so silent that even the scratch of a reporter's pen seemed loud. Mr. Obama, let's dispense with statements. The American people have heard enough of those. Let's begin. The first questions were clear, direct, anchored in the facts as laid bare by the recordings. J.D. asked about dates, about meetings, about specific language used in private conversations now exposed to public view. His tone was respectful but firm, his precision leaving little room for evasion. Obama, for all his experience, struggled beneath the weight of the moment. His answers were measured, but they circled rather than confronted. He spoke of context, of nuance, of the delicate balance of global leadership. He invoked legal frameworks, diplomatic necessity, the complexity of international relations, but with each attempt to deflect, the discomfort showed, first in the tightness of his expression, then in the slight tremor of his hands as they shifted on the table. J.D. pressed on. He cited the exact words from the second recording, asking pointedly what had been meant by future economic accommodations, by domestic flexibility, by reciprocal support on key initiatives. The former president's answers grew thinner, his reliance on abstraction more obvious, and the cameras captured it all. Across the nation, Americans watched as the man they had once trusted dodged the questions they needed answered most. J.D. paused only once, glancing at the faces of workers who had come to witness the hearing, men and women who had traveled hundreds of miles to see justice done. Then he turned back, his voice steady. Mr. Obama, the American people don't need nuance. They need the truth, and they need it here, now. The chamber held its breath, the weight of that demand hanging heavier than any speech. J.D. leaned forward, knowing that this was only the beginning of the reckoning the nation had waited for. The chamber, already taut with tension from J.D. Vance's relentless cross-examination, seemed to hold its collective breath as the next witness was called. The air crackled with anticipation. This was the moment that had been whispered about for days, the testimony that might shift the course of the entire hearing, and perhaps the nation itself. All eyes turned as the former White House aide entered. He was unremarkable in appearance, mid-40s, thinning hair, plain suit, the kind of man who could blend into any crowd. Yet at that moment, he carried the weight of truths long buried. His steps were measured, his gaze steady but heavy, as if he felt the burden of what he was about to do. He raised his right hand, took the oath, and sat. The silence so deep the soft click of the microphone being activated echoed across the room. J.D. leaned forward, voice low but clear. Sir, for the record, please state your position at the time of the meetings in question. The aide spoke evenly, though a slight tremor betrayed the gravity of the moment. I served as Deputy National Security Advisor during the period in question. And were you present for discussions involving economic concessions to foreign leaders in exchange for political considerations or diplomatic support? The aide paused, glancing briefly at the chamber filled with cameras, lawmakers, and citizens. Then he nodded. Yes, I was present for multiple discussions of that nature. A ripple ran through the room, a collective intake of breath, the sound of history turning a page. The media, so quick to dismiss J.D.'s warnings as theater, scrambled to adjust the narrative even as the cameras kept rolling. Reporters hastily scribbled notes, producers whispered urgently into earpieces, and across the country, screens lit up with breaking news banners. Aide confirms secret deals. J.D.'s voice remained steady, though he felt his pulse quicken. Can you confirm that these discussions included language promising future economic accommodations at the expense of domestic industries? Yes, the aide said, his voice firmer now. There were explicit discussions about reducing domestic capacity in certain sectors to allow for greater market access by foreign partners. The phrasing used was that American workers would, quote, absorbed the transitional impact. Audible gasps echoed through the chamber. Lawmakers shifted in their seats, some leaning forward as if to catch every word, others glancing at one another in disbelief. The former president sat rigid at the witness table, his composure faltering, his hands tightening into fists that rested on the polished wood. JD pressed on. Were these discussions intended to remain hidden from Congress and the American people? The aide nodded again, this time without hesitation. Yes, there was a clear understanding among those present that these arrangements would not be publicly disclosed. Notes were minimal, records were kept intentionally vague, and follow-up discussions were held off the official schedule. For a moment, the chamber was silent again, the weight of what had been said sinking in. The truth that so many had tried to deny, to deflect, to bury, now lay bare before the nation. JD sat back, letting the moment breathe, letting the power of the testimony settle not just over the room, but over the millions watching. The witness had done what no one else had dared. He had broken the silence. And with that, the tides of the battle shifted irrevocably. The chamber felt changed now, as if the testimony of the former aide had shifted not just the course of the hearing, but the very air inside those storied walls. The weight of long-buried truths, spoken at last, seemed to press down on everyone present. Cameras stayed fixed, capturing the stunned faces of lawmakers, the tightening expressions of those who had once dismissed J.D. Vance as reckless, and the quiet strength of the man who had demanded this reckoning from the start. J.D. let the silence linger a moment longer, giving the nation time to absorb what had been laid bare. Then he rose, the lights hot on his face, the gaze of millions upon him, not just those in the room, but those watching from factory break rooms, farmhouses, union halls, small-town diners, and crowded city apartments. The people he had fought for from the beginning. His voice, when it came, was steady, stripped of flourish, the voice not of a politician seeking headlines, but of a citizen fulfilling a duty. This wasn't about politics, J.D. said, his words carrying across the chamber and into homes and hearts across the country. It was about honor, about the promise this nation makes to its people, the promise that those who work, who sacrifice, who build and serve, will not be bartered away behind closed doors, that their labor, their dignity, their future will not be traded like currency for the benefit of the powerful. He paused, scanning the room, seeing not just senators and reporters, but the reflection of the nation's conscience in their eyes. We were told to look away, to let it go, that asking questions would divide us, would harm us, would endanger the country. But I ask you, what endangers us more, the truth or the lies we let grow when we refuse to face it? There was no applause, no immediate reaction, just that profound, heavy quiet that falls when words strike at the core of something deeper than politics. J.D. stepped back from the microphone, not in retreat, but in completion. He had said what needed saying. The rest now belonged to the people. And the people spoke. As the hearing adjourned, as the cameras followed J.D. through the hallways of the Capitol, the reaction outside was swift, overwhelming, and impossible to contain. Headlines shifted in tone and substance. Vance's stand vindicated. A voice for the working class. Honor restored. In cities and small towns alike, rallies formed not in protest but in support. Banners were raised. We stand with J.D. Truth matters. No more secrets. On factory floors, in union halls, in homes that had felt forgotten, J.D.'s name was spoken with respect. Not as a savior, not as a perfect man, but as a leader who had stood when standing was hardest, who had refused to bow when the easier path was to walk away. In the quiet of his office that night, J.D. watched the images flicker across the screen. Crowds gathered, candles held high, flags waving not in anger, but in hope. He felt no triumph, no elation, only the steady certainty that the fight for honor was not a moment, but a mission. And as he looked out at the city beneath a darkening sky, he understood that the real verdict was not in headlines or polls, but in the hearts of those he had promised to serve. A verdict that said J.D. Vance had kept faith with them, and for that he was a hero not of politics, but of the people. The morning air was crisp as J.D. Vance stepped onto the grounds of the steel mill, a place that had once stood silent, its great machines cold, its gates rusted shut, its workers scattered to jobs that paid less, offered less, meant less. Now, after months of struggle and truth brought into the open, the mill's hum had returned. Not as loud as before, there was rebuilding yet to do, but steady, strong, like the pulse of a town finding its heartbeat again. JD walked slowly across the yard, the rhythmic clang of steel on steel echoing through the air. Sparks flew where welders worked, and the familiar scent of oil and metal filled his lungs. He hadn't come for cameras. There were none. He hadn't come for applause. There was none of that either. What greeted him instead were nods. Quiet, respectful. A machinist with grease-streaked hands tipped his cap as JD passed. A foreman gave a small wave before turning back to the task at hand. These were not men and women prone to speeches or grand gestures, but in their eyes, JD saw what mattered. The acknowledgement that he had kept faith with them, that when others urged retreat, he had stood. He toured the floor, exchanging few words but many looks that said more. A young worker, no older than JD had been when he first dreamed of service, approached during a break, holding out a hand rough from labor. "Didn't think we'd see this place come back, sir, but you didn't let it go." JD took the hand, gripped it firm. "Neither did you," he said simply. The visit was brief. JD hadn't come to claim credit. The credit belonged to those who rose before dawn, who stayed late to finish the job, who believed in the worth of their work even when others tried to cheapen it. As he left, he paused once at the gate, looking back at the smokestacks reaching toward a sky just beginning to brighten. The mill lived, and with it, so did the promise that no truth, no stand, no act of courage was ever in vain. Long before the city stirred, JD found himself drawn to the steps of the Capitol. The marble was cold beneath his hand as he leaned against a pillar, watching as the first rays of dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and pale blue. Below him, the flag rose slowly on its mast, the fabric catching the light, the symbol of a nation scarred but enduring. JD breathed deep, the chill of the morning sharpening his thoughts. The battles fought, the sleepless nights, the threats, the betrayals, the moments when doubt had crept in and nearly broken him, now felt distant, as if belonging to another man. But the lesson of it all remained close. Truth is never easy, but it's always right. The words came unbidden, a quiet refrain that spoke to the cost of the path he'd chosen, and the peace that came with knowing he had walked it without compromise. He thought of Emily, of his children, of the workers who had filled the chamber during the hearing, of the young man at the mill. Faces of those who had stood with him, silently urging him forward when the weight seemed too great. He thought, too, of those who had tried to silence him, who had underestimated the strength of ordinary people, determined to defend what was theirs. The flag reached the top of the pole, unfurling in the light breeze, its colors bright against the pale sky. JD stood a long moment, watching it billow and catch the sun. No speeches, no cameras, no audience. Just a man, his conscience clear, and a nation he had tried, in his own imperfect way, to serve. In a small classroom far from Washington's marble halls, a civics teacher stood before a group of high school students, holding a remote in one hand, pausing a video on the screen behind her. The image frozen there showed JD Vance during the hearing, his expression firm, his voice caught mid-sentence. "What endangers us more? The truth or the lies we let grow when we refuse to face it?" The room was silent. The students, some leaning forward on their desks, others sitting back wide-eyed, seemed to sense they were seeing something that mattered, something real in a world that too often felt distant and staged. "This is courage," the teacher said, gesturing to the screen. Not because he was perfect, not because he had all the answers, but because when it counted, he stood. That's what civic duty looks like. That's what honor looks like. A student raised her hand. "Wasn't he scared? I mean, what if they destroyed him?" The teacher smiled gently. "I'm sure he was. But courage doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do what's right despite it." The clip resumed, JD's words filling the room once more, as if speaking not just to the students, but to the future itself. Miles away, the flag over the Capitol billowed in the morning light, the breeze carrying it high above the city. On JD's desk, the steelworker's pin he had worn throughout the fight lay in the sun's warm glow, a quiet reminder that the strength of a nation wasn't in its towers or its treasures, but in the truth its people chose to stand for. And so the story did not end, but lived on. In classrooms, in hearts, in the quiet determination of those who refused to look away when the truth called them to stand. This story reminds us that standing for truth is rarely the easy path, but it is always the one that shapes a nation's character. JD's journey wasn't about personal victory, it was about loyalty to people who believed their voices no longer mattered. His courage shows that even in a world of power plays and hidden agendas, one person's stand can inspire many. The quiet victories, the reopened mill, the student learning about honor, are what truly define lasting change. What would you do if the choice was between your comfort and the truth? Let us know, because in moments like these, it's the people who choose to act that shape our future. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.